Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to have everyone here for the next in our Luminary series that is a sort of all-school coming together to talk about important challenges and issues in public health. And if any of you were here last month, you heard me talk at the beginning just to kind of level set a welcoming position to all of us. And that's because the issues that we take on in public health, many of them are the opportunity for a heterogeneity of perspectives. And we want to make sure that we are cultivating a school where we can have courageous, difficult conversations with each other and ask questions that may reveal that we have a different perspective than others, so that we can talk through them and we can educate each other. And so I talked about that last time when we were talking about abortion rights. We are going to talk this time when we're talking about LGBTQ rights, and we'll continue to do this as we move through the Luminary series throughout the year. And I think it's just such a wonderful opportunity for us to exchange ideas and think about how we can push agendas of health and public health forward together. So I am thrilled to get to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Tonia Poteat is a colleague of mine from many years, and she is currently a professor in global health at the Duke School of Nursing, as well as I think the Institute is across all of Duke. Importantly, she, I'm going to use my notes here because I didn't print out my thing and I'll make sure I get it right. Most of it I could just say by memory, but I'll make sure I get it right. She, as you will see, and maybe already know, many of you, is world-renowned for her work in HIV and LGBTQ, human rights and public health research and advocacy. I did not know this about you until I was looking it up. She's a graduate of Yale undergrad, where it sounds like there was some transformational work when you were working with the AIDS Center there that showed to you the connection between HIV and LGBTQ rights and how those were just completely intertwined. And so I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but that's the interpretation I got from that story. And I think that must have been very powerful because now we have benefited from your passion in this area for so many years. I'm happy to say that after that time at Yale, she found her way to Atlanta, and she is a graduate of the PA program here at the Emory School of Medicine, and perhaps more importantly, also a graduate of the MPH program here at Rollins. So she is coming home in many ways to do this. Then went on to get her PhD in international health at Hopkins, and then served on the faculty in epidemiology at Hopkins, as well as the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill before arriving at Duke. In addition to that work, she spent some time working in global AIDS work with the CDC and also advising the Office of Global AIDS Coordination for the United States. So she's had a sort of breadth of experience in academia and in policy. And so we're just thrilled that we get to be the listeners of what is a marathon session for you in Atlanta. This is her third of 4 talks in 2 days while here. So please be graceful with her in that sense. And so please welcome.
Thank you, Danny. That was a great introduction, and I did not know that you knew so much about me, so it's really exciting to be here. I'm also highly caffeinated to make it through these days, so if at any point you're like, that was 700 words in 2 minutes, I'm open to feedback. Oh, hey, y'all. Like, I'm home to tell me to slow down. We good? There's also, it's a very wide room, so I'm going to try not to ignore anybody. I'd like to start with figuring out how to use this thing. Okay. Blair's got me. Oh, interesting. Okay, you have to press this and then, all right. Anyway, I'm not an IT person if that's not obvious. I like to start with the land acknowledgement. I've been very impressed by perusing Emory's website about an article I found from 2021 where Emory dug into the history of their engagement in the slave trade and dispossession, and I encourage you to read it. It's on the what used to fit on the slide, but now is doing weird things for some reason. But I think I can share my slide with folks afterwards if you want them. I'd also like to acknowledge that Blair was wrong and pressing this button doesn't work later, so I'm just going to press the screen. All right, so I can just press the button. nothing that I do happens in a vacuum. None of us do any of our work alone. And I just want to make sure that at the beginning, I acknowledge all the amazing faculty, staff. Actually, there's no faculty there, just staff, postdocs, and students who make all the work that happens possible. Okay. So for the next 45 minutes or so, this is what I want to do. And hopefully y'all are along for the ride. And I want to make sure I leave enough time for us to have conversation, because that's really the most fun part of all of this. I'm going to start with some common understanding of terms so that you at least know my perspective when I use terms, what I mean and what I'm talking about. And then outline a framework that I developed with a colleague at the University of Wisconsin called the Intersectional Research for Trans Health Justice. And then describe how I've applied that to one study in particular, but then sort of, if we have time, walk through a couple of the other studies, how we can apply it across health equity research, and then outline some potential ways forward using this framework. Okay. So the first foundational concept is around race, and I suspect that y'all have had these conversations before, and I'm telling you things you might already know. But I know that there's a common cultural misconception that race is a biological fact. And in fact, there is no fixed, coherent definition of race across place and time. As I described to people, I travel internationally for work, and I am a different race in every place that I go. So I'm African American or Black in the United States. I'm considered colored when I go to South Africa. When I was surprised to find in Senegal that I'm Claire, which is clear. I was like, I don't think so. So that was really eye-opening for me. And then the work of Charmaine Royale, who I think is an amazing person, who's at Duke in, I think, every department that exists in the university, but she does a lot of work around anti-racism and also around genetics. And she has some great books, TED Talks, podcasts, articles, her seminal one being in Nature Genetics about the non-biological way that we categorize people according to race. Racialization itself is a social process with real implications for people's health, and that we can talk about a little bit. And then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about sex and gender, shockingly, right? And I just want to remind folks, or maybe folks who have not dug deep into like the biology of sex, but we have this sort of common notion that there's two sexes and they're completely separate. But in fact, sex itself is multidimensional. There's chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, hormonal sex, internal reproductive organs, and external reproductive organs. And all of those may align in ways that we expect them to, and they may not. And in fact, 1.7% of the US population is estimated to have these non-binary sex traits. Gendered socialization begins from the time someone is born. There's been these amazing studies of how people play with infants, newborns, very differently, depending on whether they were told they were a boy or a girl. And so often we begin sort of reifying these gendered socialization and think that they're sex traits. I might need Blair to help me because me touching the screen. Oh, Blair's gone. Okay, well, I'm just going to touch the screen. Gender, as we probably know, is diverse and expansive. Florence Ashley is a philosopher who works at a law school in Canada and has done a lot of writing around gender. And she's coined a term called gender modality, which I find very useful. And that is a term that really tells whether one's assigned sex at birth, and she calls it assigned gender, corresponds to one's gender identity. And if they are the same, one's called cisgender. If they're different, one's called transgender. And then there's other categories of people who don't ascribe to gender at all. And there are some people who are gender non-binary. Gender identity refers to how someone describes their own gender. So I've been trying very hard to differentiate those things and to talk about them appropriately. And I have that little picture in the corner because that's just a list of gender identity terms that this one person who published knew about. So there's a lot of ways people describe their gender. There's about 2 million people who are transgender in the US, and transgender people represent about 2% of the worldwide population based on a study done in 27 different countries. We also know that people of color are overrepresented sounds really weird, but I spent a lot of time in an epi department, so I use that term. But a greater proportion of people of color identify as trans than white people in the United States. So now let's dig into the framework that I want to talk to you all about. And I saw Allie walk in, and Allie's able to find Blair, so I can use this little clicker that helps me feel less like I'm a prisoner right here. Okay, great. Thank you. So the intersectionality research for trans health justice is really based on 3 important frameworks. The first is intersectionality, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The second is structural justice, and the third is community engagement. So what are some of the core tenets of intersectionality? People teach whole courses on intersectionality, so if we could get Blair to help make this work, that would be awesome. Whole courses on intersectionality, so I'm not going to do it justice. Lisa Boleg, if she was here, would like shake me because I'm not spending time talking about the foundations of intersectionality and Black feminist thought and going through our foremothers for that, but forgive me, 45 minutes. But it is a concept that's based in Black feminist theory and critical race theory. But 3 of the core tenets that I think are important for what we're going to talk about today and that inform the framework. Oh, wow, now it's moving by itself. That's amazing. Oh, wow, okay. So I was talking about structures of power. I have Wall Street, the financial system that we live in. Capitalism is something that we believe is like been forever, but it's not been forever and it's not everywhere, but it definitely influences how we exist in this country in ways that I don't think I have to explain to any of you as you are students and probably thinking about all of your student loan debt. And then I have a chapel here because we are a country that is heavily influenced by religion, and religion influences our politics, and politics influences our daily lives. And then finally, another core tenet of intersectionality is social location. And I used to always wonder where the term marginalized came from, like what does that even mean? And this beautiful graphic developed by some Canadian feminists helps depict that. If you think about the center of power being in the middle of that wheel, and people with certain identities are closer to that center of power, and people with other identities are farther from that center of power. And depending on what aspect of your social categories you're talking about, you might be closer to centers of power in one and farther from centers of power in another. And that is really important for thinking about how the structures of power influence our health. Structural injustice is a concept that was put forward by Iris Young. And that, I think, is really important to think about all of our responsibilities in terms of working towards health justice. This is the concept that each of us, by going through our normal daily lives, are perpetuating the injustices that are built into our systems, things that we don't even think about. And I think in terms of my work, one of the common things that I know I never thought about for many, many years is that when I go to the bathroom and I see the triangle, I go in that one. And I see another bathroom and there's a square, I know that somebody else is supposed to go in that one. Never questioned it, never thought about what that might mean for anybody else other than me. But that is a structure that means that some people are neither a square or a triangle. Some people want to go in the triangle, but other people don't think they belong there, so they face risk of violence in that triangle bathroom, right? And that's something that literally everywhere we go is built in, and it's part of the status quo. And working towards justice often requires us to push against the status quo. And finally, what I was attempting to say in the last one, I tried to depict in my very bad use of PowerPoint graphics, where thinking about intersectionality and thinking about, especially when we do research in public health and we include certain variables in our model, thinking about what they mean and how they act, and especially thinking about that process in the middle. So sometimes we'll see the social categories on the left, and we'll put those in our models as things that affect a health outcome. And then we'll look at the health outcome at the end, a health inequity or a social inequity. But what we may not remember to do that is really critical is speak to that social process that connects those two things, right? Somebody doesn't experience a health inequity because of their gender or because of their race. They experience it because of sexism and because of racism. Then the third aspect of this research framework is meaningful community engagement. And I think it was a representative from Georgia that said the phrase, people closest to the pain should be closest to the solution. And that's basically what that means. Trying to develop a solution in terms of health equity without involving people who are affected most by that health inequity is not going to lead you to the most powerful and effective solutions. And community engagement can happen along many ways. You can see, I love this one because it says degree of difficulty and public health impact, right? So the more impact is, the harder it is to do, right? So the easiest thing to do is just let people know that you're doing research. Consulting them is a little bit harder. Involving them is harder. Collaborating is harder. And empowering them is super hard. And in fact, I would say that most people empower themselves and we get out of the way. And that can be hard given how our structures are set up. And I finally wanted to talk about the difference between health equity and justice. And I'm used to seeing the graphic on the right where equality is assuming everybody needs the same thing, equity is giving people things according to their need, and justice is removing barriers. But what I didn't like about that is there's still a fence there. Why is there a fence there? Right? And there is another graphic that I wasn't able to find that has liberation where the fence is gone altogether. What I like about the one on the left is that you can see that hopefully you can see there's two people both trying to get an apple from the tree. All the apples are on one side of the tree, so the person on one side is like, hey, where's my apple, right? And then we go to equality where everybody gets a ladder to reach, but then that person on the right still can't reach it because the tree is leaning over, right? Then we go to equity. It's like, okay, the person on the right gets a taller ladder so they can reach the tree, but all of the apples are still on the other side of the tree, right? Because the tree is bent over. So justice is correcting that foundational piece, right? So that the apples grow on all the sides of the tree and everybody can reach. We good? All right. I'm no Kamara Jones with my allegories, but I'm doing my best here. All right. So this is also in the paper that describes this research framework, and I'll walk you through it because I cannot tell you how many hours we spent like trying to figure out how to make a picture out of what we were thinking. So this is the best we could do. I'm sure there's better people out here for doing it. But on the left-hand side, we try to lay out along the social ecological model intersectional causes of health inequity, starting at the structures of domination, institutional systems, and social cultural processes that I've talked about already, and thinking about how all those interrelate to lead to cause the health inequities that we see in the arrow down. And then we thought about, okay, we want this framework to be useful for researchers. So what do we want researchers to do to move us towards health justice? And what are we calling ourselves to do to move towards health justice? And those three things are listed here, and I'm going to talk through how I try to apply them in my research. One is make sure that whenever we're writing, talking grant applications, papers, speaking with our colleagues, and we're talking about health inequities, that we're naming the power relations that drive those health inequities. So there's never any confusion or concern that we're actually blaming people who experience health inequities for their problems. Disrupting the status quo, and we can talk a little bit about what that looks like in the context of structures like academic institutions, and centering embodied knowledge. So this is a website for our lab. Feel free to run by and check it out anytime you want to. But these are the graphics from some of the studies that we are doing in our lab. And I'm going to focus on the CARE study first. And that's what I'm going to spend most of our time talking about. So in thinking about trans health inequities in particular, we know that trans people experience interlocking systems of oppression based on gender identity, depending on race, perceived sexual orientation, a variety of things. So these are just two of the ways that our social systems are impacting the lives of trans people. If you've opened a newspaper or listened to the news, you are probably aware that there is an incredible push for anti-trans legislation across the United States, right? So this is a tracker that was updated, I think, just a month or two ago. 595 bills so far introduced into the United States, anti-trans bills. 42 have passed across 43 states. There are anti-CRT measures that are happening across the United States. I was looking for a graphic for all the anti-DEI movements that are happening across the state, and those things are connected. And if you look at the maps of the states where the most activity is happening around that, those maps often overlap. Not surprising, this leads to increase in hate crimes as there's sort of this public perception of trans people as targets. Not surprising, that leads to higher levels of discrimination. These are data from the TransPop survey, which was the first nationally representative sample of a study specifically enrolling transgender people. I won't go through the details of that because we spent a lot of time like reorganizing PowerPoint. This level of discrimination comes with impacts, right? So people have lower levels of education because they experience bullying in school, might not do as well, might drop out of school early, those kinds of things. People are discriminated against in employment, so they're more likely to be unemployed, more likely to live in poverty, more likely to owe money, more likely to have housing instability. There are psychological impacts as well. I've talked to some of my friends about how they protect their health when every day you turn on the radio and somebody's talking about how you shouldn't exist. And these are some of the data from TransPop around the differences in cisgender and transgender people in terms of psychological distress. Not surprisingly, COVID-19 worsened these inequities, and you can see some of the papers that came out about that here, about how everybody's experience of the pandemic was not the same, and those who were already experiencing inequities had those deepened in ways that were more severe, and particularly transgender people. We saw high rates of psychological distress and suicidal ideation, unfortunately, at baseline, elevated levels of poverty at baseline, and we found out that through work at the Williams Institute that trans people were twice as likely to lose their jobs, more likely to have worsening psychological outcomes related to COVID-19 pandemic. And what I personally saw was trans community leaders stepping up to the plate and doing amazing work, supporting their communities, starting support groups that were online, providing small grants to people who needed it, helping people access gender affirming care when they could no longer go to a health center, things like that. And particularly the Black Trans Advocacy Coalition was doing amazing work around mentoring, peer mentoring, and grants. And this is going to be important because that is our primary community partner for the study that I'm going to be talking to you about. So when thinking about what I, as a researcher, could contribute to justice in this context, someone who cares a lot about transgender health and addressing health inequities, I started thinking about, well, what are the frameworks that we've been using and how can we disrupt those, right? So we know that this is the minority stress model. How many people have seen this before? Oh, not as many as I thought. Or y'all just shy? You're just like, maybe I've seen it, maybe not. In case you haven't, the big picture is that people with minoritized identities experience health inequities that are driven by extreme stress that we all experience because we're living in the world, stress that's specific to having a minoritized experience and having people discriminate against you, and then sometimes taking that in and having negative beliefs about yourself that leads to negative mental health outcomes, and not in this slide, but also physical health outcomes. Coping and social support are two of the ways to mitigate that. So having positive, healthy coping mechanisms and having social support around you. So most of the research built on the minority stress model has been looking at this place where we interrupt the stress process. How do we help people how do we reduce prejudice? How do we reduce violence? But very little, and in fact, I haven't seen any that focuses on reducing general stressors. And I would argue that general stressors, like poverty, are related to the discrimination that people experience. So they're not separate processes, so we can interrupt there as well. I also thought about what the community was saying to researchers about how we do research on transgender health. I'm an HIV researcher, right? I've been doing HIV research for a long time. The community's like, look, we are more than just HIV. Please do something else other than only HIV research, right? They wanted us to do research that would help, that was community engaged and would help address the pressing issues of the time. And they wanted us to look at what are the strengths of the community, what are positive, and how can we look at resilience? What supports resilience? That's what they were asking of us. So this is Carter Brown, who is the executive director of the National Black Trans Advocacy Coalition. He and I had a great conversation about how we could look at the work that the Black Trans Advocacy Coalition was doing around providing financial support and around providing peer support, and provide some evidence for the efficacy of that intervention that could help them get funding and keep this going in the future. So we collaborated on a grant application with the aims that you see here. We wanted to look at the efficacy of microgrants with or without peer mentoring for reducing psychological distress among transgender people who are experiencing material hardship. We wanted to look at the mechanism by which it was effective, if it was, and hear the voices of the people who had experienced this intervention to see what they thought and how they felt about it. So those are our research questions. The design was a 3-arm design. We would love to have a 4-arm design, as I told the reviewers in the 3 different times I had to submit this grant application before it got funded. But NIH has a cap. And if you're giving people money as your intervention, you can't go beyond the cap because you don't have any money. So anyway, that's why it's 3 arms instead of 4. We felt like it was really important that people in the usual care arm got something. So those folks got a one-time microgrant, which was what BTAC was able to give during the pandemic. The people in the second arm got microgrants monthly for 6 months. And then folks in the third arm got peer mentoring and the microgrants. And you might say, well, why $150? Where did that come from? So part of it was that BTAC was giving $125. Inflation happens. We could give $150. But also when we looked into the literature, and this is going to be very, very depressing, but we looked at some of our previous data on studies we had done with transgender people, and this represents about 12% of the income of the average income of participants in our prior studies. So there's a high level of poverty, right? This is also what, I forget the organization, one of the national organizations represents that says this would be the proportion of your income that you spend on food, which I thought was interesting. So we had to justify this amount. Part of it was community justification, what they could offer and what they thought they could sustain if this was shown to be efficacious. And some of it was around the real lived experience of poverty in the community. We also made sure that we provided not only the one-time microgrant, but also financial education. This came from a prior study that we had done as well, where we were looking at HIV prevention interventions related to financial support. And we asked people in focus groups, what kind of things do you feel like you need to learn or want to learn around financial management that could help you? And that's where these topics came from. So we release videos with a different topic every month, and the last month they get a resource guide to links to other more advanced topics, as well as links to the topics that we gave them and other resources. For the folks in ARMS B and C, they also get a monthly microgrant in the form of a gift card. Would I love to send people cash? Would they love to receive cash? Absolutely. Will the university let me send people cash? No. So that's why they get the gift card. That was the closest we could get to giving people cash. And they have the option, I don't know if anybody's ever used Tango cards, but you have the option of either picking a store, getting a Visa card, or having an electronic Visa card, or having them mail you a card. So if people choose to get a card mailed, then they can take it to an ATM and get the money out. So that was the best we could do to get people cash. For the peer mentoring arm, we had an adaptation meeting with the person who developed the Healthy Divas intervention, which is a peer mentoring intervention for trans women. Jay Sevelius developed that. They came down to meet with us. Carter Brown came up to meet with us, and Akani is the mentoring program that they had that was designed specifically for trans men. We looked at what was in common across those and what could we put forward in our own peer mentoring program for the CARE study. And we came up with the facilitator guide there. And you can see we also spent a lot of time looking for resources, both financial and social and medical resources, to put together in a guide for the peer mentors to use when they were interacting with participants, but also for participants to have access to themselves. The peer mentoring intervention was not a psychology intervention. These are peers. They're not trained to handle psychiatric problems. So we, in our training, make sure they know when to refer and when to connect people to those kind of resources. But it was around helping people meet goals. And their goals may or may not be financial goals. So we have, in the first session, they fill out this thing I keep calling the level 10 life exercise. If you've never done it, it's really fascinating. You make this wheel, you put the different aspects of your life, and then you color in as far as you think you are doing in your life. Like maybe you're doing great with your education, but you're not doing so great with your health. And then people look at that. We all figure out where they want to focus their attention for their peer mentoring, the 6 peer mentoring sessions they're going to have. And then we help with resources and skills towards meeting those goals. But this is the schema for the study. People are recruited, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do community engaged recruiting. They're randomized to one of the arms. They complete a baseline survey. A subset complete a qualitative interview at 3 months. At 6 months, they complete a survey after their last microgrant and financial education video. We do another qualitative interview 9 months later to see, so what do you think about this after it's over? Did it make any sort of lasting change in your life? And then we do the survey to get that sort of quantitative from all the participants. We also do a text survey to all the participants at 3 months, and we've incorporated these questions into 6 months because we want to know, well, what are you doing with the money, right? So we're going to ask them what they're doing with the money. Oh, we're also measuring psychological distress, depressive symptoms, anxiety, substance use, because there is a lot of concern that if you give people extra money, then they're going to use it to buy drugs. I don't know why we're obsessed with people using money to buy drugs, but we are. So we included those questions. In order to participate, people have to be experiencing material hardship. So we ask questions about that, and we ask questions about their sources of social support. This is the resource guide. I think one of the important things that we've learned too is that for peer mentors, so other trans people who are experiencing the same challenges as the people that they're mentoring, giving them support is important too. So for the peer mentors, they have access to the guide. We also have a relationship with BetterHelp, which is an online therapy service, so that they're free vouchers that are available to the peer mentors if they need and want to engage in counseling. There's also, we've hired a counselor who provides, supervision, which I think is a strange term for being able to talk to a counselor if you need to, for support. So we want to make sure we take care of the peer mentors, not just the peers, not just the people participating in the study. How many people have done studies online or participated in a, yes, okay. And how many people have had like 9,000 bots take part in your study? Yes. All the faculty are raising their hand. Yes. So it's become a huge problem in online research. We wanted this to be a study for anybody living in the South. We thought it was important to focus on trans people in the South. And we had to have it online because we can't be everywhere in the South. But we also know that as soon as you have an incentive for a study and you have a study whose intervention is to give money, you are basically opening the door for bots and fraudulent participants. So we have been very careful about how we advertise and allow access to the study. So all of the study staff are trans people themselves. We're collaborating with a trans organization, and we are reaching out to other trans organizations across the South, having conversations with them, building partnerships with them, and inviting them to share this information with people who are their constituents that they think might benefit from being in the study. It's been a slower process, but I think we have mostly avoided bots and scammers. And we've also had the opportunity to build these amazing relationships across the South with trans-led organizations. So we're thinking about, after the study is over, how do we continue to build on those relationships? And we've been in conversation with them about how they want to partner with our research team. So this is the timeline. The pandemic started, everything went to hell in a handbasket, as my mama would say. And then we developed the study 3 times until it was funded. We started the launch in 2023. We had our full launch at the beginning of 2024. We have enrolled, our goal is to enroll 360 to 400 participants, and we're at about 200 now. Last week, we got 200 interest forms from Mississippi. I don't know what person in Mississippi who is a social influencer told all their friends, but now we're trying to think about, well, do we want to have a study that's half in the South and half in Mississippi? Or how are we going to manage that? So that's where we are in terms of the CARE study launch right now. But it's been going really, knock on wood, really well. And so in thinking about what does this have to do with the intersectionality research for trans health justice framework, I'm going to walk through the 3 things that we want to make sure that we try to do for all of our studies. Naming structures of power. So we name in the grant application, and when we talk about the study, discrimination as the causal factor for the inequities that people are experiencing. And we had a lot of arguments with the NIH reviewers about this, that we think that we're intervening at a structural level. We might be giving money to individuals, but we're giving money to individuals who live in a capitalist society that requires that they have money to have basic needs met, right? And that's a structure that we're trying to intervene on. We're trying to disrupt the status quo by looking at general stressors instead of focusing on individual minority stressors, and either building resilience or reducing stigma and discrimination, which are all very important things to do, but are the status quo for how people are thinking about intervening around stigmatized populations. We're not doing an HIV study. We have no HIV questions on our survey. Everybody's just sort of shocked by that. And we're including people of all gender identities with a transgender modality. And we're building it on a community-derived intervention. This is something the community created themselves. They were already doing. We thought we could help benefit by providing data to support their work. And we have an equitable partnership with BTAC, which I think they sometimes regret because they are full NIH co-investigator on the study. And then they learned that being an NIH co-investigator is painful, right? They had to get a DUNS number. They had to do the whole regulatory nightmare. So we've been trying to be as supportive as we can because we know that they're a community organization trying to do their community work. They're not researchers. So where we can provide support, we do that. But we make sure that people know that they're an equitable partner. I have no idea what time it is. It's 12:40. Okay. So I think that's enough about me describing things in the lab. So I'm going to skip all these. Yay! Running through the other studies in the lab. You can ask about them later. what did we learn? What have we been learning as a lab while we've been together? Shockingly, to no one in here, community engaged research is hard. It's messy. I'm happy to talk about the mess because I think you get these pretty research papers. You think that they describe the methods and that's how it went. And then you go to work on a research study and you're like, what is this hot mess? And that is how research works. And if you're going to do community engaged research, it's going to be extra messy because people are going to have feelings. They're going to be mad. People have sometimes been traumatized by researchers who come in, take their data, run away, don't partner with them. They see no results. And they're going to come at you with that experience behind them. And you have to prove yourself trustworthy. And that's part of community engaged work. We have to address structural drivers. And this is really hard because if you get most of your funding from NIH, like I do, then NIH talks about being interested in structural change, but like structural change involves changing structures. And I think one of the structures that could be changed is NIH, right? Because they make it really hard to do community engaged research and community partnerships. That said, we can't abandon things because they're hard. We also can't abandon hard places. Like at this point, there's anti-trans legislation all across the country, but much of that is concentrated in the South, right? There are places where you're not even supposed to say the word trans, where you can't use the pronoun somebody asks you to use for them. In those places, we still need to do our work towards equity and justice. And I would say even more so, we need to do our work in those places. So what do I recommend as ways forward? These are built on the three actions that we think health equity researchers can take along the naming power, disrupting the status quo, and setting the margins. So asking ourselves when we're thinking about doing research, how have intersecting power hierarchies shaped or constrained my own experiences in the academy? How have they shaped the experiences of the participants? How I'm thinking about implementing a study or the study I'm planning to do or how I write about the study actually contribute to those, and how can I interrupt that? Sometimes diagramming pathways can help that. Anybody in EPI done a DAG? They can actually be helpful. How does my social position affect my research decisions? Community engaged research takes a long time. You have to build trust, you have to build relationships, and that can be really hard, especially if you're a student and you want to do community engaged research, but you know you're going to be there for like a year, 2 years, and then you're going to go back to wherever you came from or to a new place. How do you engage in that community engaged research in a meaningful way that doesn't feel extractive with the community organization? And that's an important conversation to have, and also to think about your own limitations in that setting. And how is the study centering the voices of folks who are most impacted? How are you being accountable to the community? How are you involving them? And then finally, what can we all do, whether we're researchers or not, if we want to contribute to justice in our lives? Thinking about the reality of our own experiences and how we might have gotten to where we are right now. What is the socio-political history of your family or of your social group? Thinking about everyday actions you could take to disrupt the status quo, identifying concrete steps that you can do. I know that I come from a conservative Christian family. Trans health and rights is not something they know about or would naturally have supported. And conversations with my parents about this can sometimes be painful. But I have them because they love me and I love them, and they're willing to listen and I'm willing to listen. And I know that they're coming from a place of love. And having those hard conversations means that when they were pastors for many years, when they go to their congregation and when they're talking to their friends, they have taken what we've talked about out into the community. So it's a tiny step, but it's a big step. I remember I almost cried one time when my mother said she was sitting at the nail salon, because my mother goes to the nail salon. I do not go to the nail salon. She's at the nail salon and she's hearing her friends talking about trans people. And she said to them, well, you say those things because you don't think you know any trans people. You don't really know anything about it. I was so proud of her, I almost cried because she had been listening with an open heart to the things that we had been talking about and incorporated them into her way of viewing the world so much that she felt comfortable having those conversations with her friends. And I think those are important. And I will end there in terms of radical listening and talking, and with one of my sheroes, Audre Lorde, who I have that little statement taped above my desk, When I dare to be powerful and use my strength in the service of my vision, it becomes less and less important whether or not I'm afraid. Because pushing against the status quo is scary, right? Doing it is so important. And one thing that you can all do, if you haven't already, is please vote. So I'd love to have a conversation about any of those things for the however much time we have left. We good? Yeah. Okay.
All right, folks, please open it up.
And I'm sorry I ignored all of you over there.
MSc from the AP department.
I know you.
Just one question for you. Really looking at the, and thank you for the presentation, informative and always good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Within our work sometimes, within research, hesitation, medical mistrust, and even being affiliated with an institution that has a history of racism is oftentimes like barriers to really having Black, Indigenous people of color be involved in research. But, and I like to personally believe that it's not for a community to automatically just trust us because we are researchers. But I guess the question is, how do we demonstrate trustworthiness to increase by participation in our research?
I promise I did not plant that question, but I love it. And that's why I said it takes a long time. I can just tell you my own experience. So I moved to Baltimore, and I started volunteering for a trans-led organization. And I just showed up on, now I'm a person who goes to bed at 9 o'clock. I would just tell you that. I need to go to bed at 9 o'clock. But I would show up, I would go to bed at 9 o'clock and I would get up at 11 and I would go out from midnight to 3 because there was a trans-led organization that was doing safer sex, education, condoms, clean needles, and volunteer because I wanted to get to know the community for one. I wanted to give back to the community. And I had some time as a student versus when I was working full time. This was before the dissertation phase when all that time disappeared. But anyway, so I started there. And then I listened to what I thought I might be able to contribute as a researcher as I move forward in my research education and in my research career. So by the time I came to the community with a research question, they knew me. They knew I cared enough to show up in my free time to do stuff. And that's how I built trustworthiness. I know that might not be feasible for everybody. If you've got kids that you got to put to bed, you're not going to leave them from midnight to 3. You know, like there are constraints in all of our lives. But where we can show up and demonstrate that we care beyond our paid workplace, that's helpful. Because communities, it's not their job, right? It's our job to do research, not theirs. So how can we demonstrate that we care about them? And that's why we're doing research. I don't know if that's helpful. Sure. Yes.
I was thinking back to what you were saying about having those difficult conversations with like family members, for example, on things like trans rights or like, you know, even basic information that as like somebody in the LGBTQ community, like I understand, but for example, like my brother and his girlfriend are like not so involved in, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious in your personal experience, what do you think the best way to like approach those conversations and have like a productive conversation with somebody who maybe isn't so supportive of like those rights and, you know, those kinds of things and perhaps like educated on the subject? How do you approach that and like make it constructive?
Okay. I forgot that I'm supposed to repeat the question. So thank you, Allie. So I'm going to encapsulate your question into how do you start having those difficult conversations with people who may be in a different space about those topics than you are. This might sound counterintuitive, but I try to start by just listening. I've had a couple really powerful experiences where I just listened and asked some questions, and then like people came flooding forth with an experience that they had that led to their negative view of a community or of an intervention or something like that. And that helps me place their concerns in like their real lived experience. I can approach it with empathy instead of with like, you hate trans people, because they don't, right? And then talk to them from that place where I don't think they're a bad person. I don't think that they're stupid. I think they've had an experience or experiences that have informed their view. And I've had different experiences and I can share mine. And so that's been really helpful also to keep me from like having indigestion because I'm like mad all the time. But also people can feel when you're authentic and trying to radically listen, and that really helps. And I was telling a friend who thought I was crazy. I was trapped in an airplane next to a guy who wanted to talk to me about all the difficult topics on Earth for 5 hours. He started with like, who you voting for? And I'm like, wow, okay. This is 5 minutes into our 5-hour flight. But it ended up being a great conversation. We are really different people. He was about as different from me as you possibly could be. Like, he took like rich people on fishing trips out in like exotic places for a living. And he started talking about trans athletes and how about unfair advantage. And I was listening to what he was saying, and he's like, don't you think that's unfair? I said, actually, I think that the public doesn't know a lot about sex and about sex traits and sex differences. And that's part of why there's this confusion about trans athletes. And he was like, really? Tell me more. And it was a great conversation. I didn't have to be mad and take like Pepto-Bismol. Hopefully he left with a better understanding of why he might not have changed his mind, but at least why people who disagree with him might disagree with him. I give really long answers. I can try to shorten them. Yes. Oh, what am I supposed to? Am I supposed to do something with this computer? Oh, Candace, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hey, thank you so much for an amazing talk. This was so good. Okay, I want to know about the mess, because as a community engaged researcher, the mess is real. Human beings are messy. And so I want to know, one, that I'm not alone, and what type of mess you've experienced and how you continue to be engaged in the process to work through it.
Thank you for that question. I know people have to leave, so don't feel like compelled to stay if you have other things you need to do. And also, Danny can tell me to shut up.
We'll stay until 1, but some have classes, so that's why.
Okay. I can give so many messy examples. So one of the messy examples, I worked into a job interview question. So my job interview question was, so you're at a community meeting and of your community advisory board, right? So people have signed up to be on your community advisory board. And somebody stands up and says, all you researchers are the same. You come here, you steal our data, and then you disappear, and nothing is better in our community. How would you respond to that? And then one of the people I was interviewing said, I would yell back. And I was like, okay, great, thank you. So I don't need to work with you. So that happens a lot. That's some of the mess. It's been about a year and a half, but it was a very traumatic experience. It was the first conference I organized after the pandemic. It was a conference on community engaged research with trans people, something I think I know a little about, right? Brought together other researchers from across the South. I asked them to bring their community partners and themselves, and gave them small group time to work together on building a research agenda together. The opening talk was with somebody from NIH with the Compass Initiative, which is one of these initiatives around community engaged research. So after the Compass Initiative person talked, someone stood up in the audience and like literally picked me out and was like, you should not be running this conference. I should be running this conference. And I was like, okay. And that was really difficult. I literally went home and cried and called my friends, and they made me feel better, promised never to organize another conference. But it's messy, right? Like, I understood that she felt that a trans woman should be running a conference about trans health. I also knew that she literally had no idea what a crappy job it is to organize a conference. It looks all cute when you're standing up at the front at the end of all the organization and you're like welcoming everybody, but she wasn't there for the 9 months of like slogging and pulling it together. But I wasn't going to say that at the conference. That would be completely inappropriate. But it was difficult. It was difficult. I don't know if that's helped. That's my mess.
It was so good. Thank you so much for sharing.
Anytime you want
I had
messy
the
stories.
same thought where I was like, oh, if they knew how managing a conference was, we'd be like, no, you were right to go ahead and leave.
Yeah, I was like, I gladly hand it over. Yes.
Thank you. This is a really great talk. Really great. My question kind of goes back to the difficult conversation, but on a different note, more with the NIH. Like you said, NIH itself is an institution that kind of is
Yeah, be really annoying. And I mean that not lightly. Like, so this grant got funded, which I was literally shocked by. I was like, NIH is paying me to give trans people money. I had to keep submitting for that to happen. I've also am on study section, which means I review NIH grants, which it took a long time to be invited, and it takes a lot of work, and they pay you almost nothing to do it. But it means I can be a voice in the room, and the NIH reviewers are there. Like big NIH isn't there, but the reviewers are there, so that has some of the impact. I talk to program officers whenever I get a chance about what some of the challenges are. Like one of my literally seemingly small but big pet peeves is we have to report annually, and we have to report by race and sex or gender or whatever they mean by that form. And I keep asking, what do you mean by this form? And how am I supposed to fill this form out? And where am I supposed to put non-binary people? And they haven't changed it yet, but I'm going to just annoyingly every year complain about the form. I don't know. I mean, a march on NIH doesn't sound like it would be all that effective. They're scattered all around. But yeah, I would just like whenever you have an opportunity to annoy someone with your complaints about them, I would just do it. With a smile on your face like this, right? Just like, I'm just going to be annoying right now. Fix this. I know it's not the revolution, but I try. Okay. Mishra? Bushra. Whoever has your hand raised, you can unmute, because I think I just butchered your name. I'm sorry.
Yes, Bushra. Can you hear me?
Now I can see your name. Yes.
Okay, my question is if you can please delve into a little bit into the biology of the athleticism thing that you just mentioned.
Okay. So that goes back to, sorry, I'm going to take you, that thing that I hate for people to do when they go back in their slides, but.
Perfectly fine.
I know, hopefully nobody has like a seizure. Oh, yes, so this one. So I think one example is if anybody followed the Paris Olympics, the boxing situation, there was a boxer who won, and then there was a gender challenge against that boxer. And it turns out that that boxer so they were challenging whether or not that boxer was quote unquote really a woman. And it turned out, first of all, it's none of our business to know what her genes are, but we do. We know that that boxer has XY chromosomes, right? But what we also know is there's an SRY gene that turns on and off the activities of the so-called sex chromosomes. So you can have XY chromosomes and also be phenotypically what's standardly considered a woman. And that is true for her. So we also know that there is enormous overlap in athletic ability across genders that we often don't talk about because we separate people early into gendered sports. And the last thing I'd say, especially when we're talking about the Olympic level, I was like, no Olympian's body is typical, right? Didn't Michael Phelps like basically have wings for arms? Like people's bodies don't naturally do what Simone Biles' body does. So there's no athlete that does not come to the Olympics with some sort of physiologic advantage. And so to ask them to have this one aspect of their physiology fit within a certain frame to be allowed to compete isn't really consistent with the whole idea of being an Olympic level athlete. So those are the things I said to the guy on the plane. I don't know if they meant anything to him, but that's what I said.
Well, now we all want to ride on a plane with you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you for asking.
So please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Oh, I still wanted to end on vote.
Oh, yes. Put that back.
Okay, we're going back to voting. Sorry. Voting is public health. Whoa. Hi, good to see you. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm still getting to vote. There we go.
Hi. That was so great. So happy to see you. Twice. Twice in 2 months or 3 months.
I know, right?
That's amazing.
Yes, it's been lovely to come back. Thank you.